I was drinking with some friends a few nights ago, swapping stories from old times, when my old roommate reminded me of these guys I used to hang out with. Or, as he put it, that time you hung out with those crazy pagans out in the woods. The crazy pagans in question were a coven I crossed paths with while living in North Georgia. No one tells you, when you move here, that there are a lot of non-Christian communes in the North Georgia hills, and given my interests, I ran into a lot of them. I've met pagans, druids, Wiccans, and many other practitioners of strange and foreign beliefs. Most are just hobbyists, people with a passing interest who find the mystic section of Barnes & Noble and go a little nuts. However, some of these guys take this stuff very seriously, and sometimes they take it a little too far. This story is about one of those groups. I had taken a semester of religious studies, and it had led me down a rabbit hole that had led me to a general interest in occult and mysticism. This led to a lot of brooding in the back of my college library, reading over old books, and making notes on strange subjects and odd topics. I had taken an interest in runes, and that was how I met Patrick, or Wormwood as he was calling himself in those days. He was teaching me about runes in exchange for some notes I'd made on energy exchange. We became friends and started hanging out a bit at a coffee shop in Dahlonega that catered to our sort of crowd. That was how I met Amadeus. Now, as enamored as I was with the idea of mysticism, Amadeus was still a little weird. I arrived to meet with Patrick one day to find a man in his mid-40s sitting next to him. His gray hair was braided down his back, his bald crown was oiled and gleaming, and he wore an honest-to-God traveling cloak, not one of those Hot Topic long coats that his crowd usually wore. His shirt was obscured with silver charms hung on long leather thongs about his neck, and he stared at me as he sat, fingers steepled across his eyes in a decidedly wizard fashion. He began following very probing questions at me before Patrick could make introductions. He wanted to know what I knew about everything from runes to tarot to demonology to herbcraft and everything in between. I was studied in quite a few subjects and was happy to flex my knowledge for him, so we spent about an hour talking shop. If I'd known what he wanted, I'd have left right then. He must have been impressed with what I had to say. "You seem pretty knowledgeable. It appears that Wormwood did not exaggerate your abilities. I'm looking for someone to come into the woods with us for a gathering. I need someone capable of setting up and maintaining a protective circle around our campsite, and to act as a guide while we await the spirits. I'm willing to pay if you're willing to come out for the weekend." We talked a little bit about what was expected, and we came to an arrangement. I would set up his protective circle, provide scholarly advice, and keep them from wandering off into the woods in the event that something took notice of our gathering. This would be a standard gathering for them, some 30-odd members of their coven coming together, and Amadeus was pretty clear that this was likely to get rowdy. He would give me $250 today, and another $250 at the end of the weekend. As a poor college student, it sounded pretty good to me. I had done similar things before, setting up circles and safeguarding people. Sounded like an easy $500 at the time. I took his money and set about getting a few things together for that weekend. I'd need a few things to pull this off, but honestly, I wasn't expecting much more than some drinking in the woods and a bit of babysitting. By Friday, I had assembled my components and made my way to the agreed-upon spot. They had decided not to use an established campground, but instead had decided to camp in a section of the wood they claimed to have heard about from someone in our circle. I arrived to find about 6 other vehicles down an access road, most of them old vans. Just as I was wandering off into the woods, however, one of the doors slid open and out popped a short blonde woman in a homemade dress. I say short, but she was probably about 5'2", with a long spill of silver blonde hair. She asked my name, and I told her, and she told me hers was Andromeda, but I could call her Angie. She was going to be my guide for the weekend. Amadeus said I should keep an eye out for you. I'm to assist you in anything you might need this weekend. That should have been a huge red flag, but I kind of shrugged it off at the time. Angie led the way, and we walked about a mile into the woods. She chattered all the way about how much she had been looking forward to this weekend. She said that Amadeus had been researching this area and thought that it was a good spot for communing with spirits. The area was reputed for sightings, and the coven was hopeful they could make contact with whatever lived in these woods. They kept saying coven, but as the campsite came into view, I was beginning to wonder if cult wasn't a better word. The clearing was a circle, 30 feet wide, with about 12 tents set up inside. The forest loomed around the campsite, and the old forest seemed to resent having a section of itself gouged out so people could camp. At the center of the tents was a fire pit, a big one, with a lot of styrofoam coolers sitting around it. I could see people bustling about the campsite, making adjustments to tents and setting up sleeping bags. Angie led me to the fire pit where Amadeus was reading a book and smoking what smelled like a joint. He looked at my duffel bag and asked if I'd brought enough supplies to put a circle around the whole campsite. I told him I had, but I was already doing the math and realizing the sage I had brought would go quickly. He nodded and told me there were supplies in his tent if I needed them. He told me also that Angie was going to work with me this weekend. "Use her in any capacity you see fit," he said, and a lecherous grin spread across his face that was hard to miss. That was red flag number 2. Seeing as most of his coven members were women, I was beginning to get a pretty good idea about what sort of setup I had stumbled across. I felt a little squeamy about it, but if they were comfortable with it, then who was I to judge? I had already decided what capacity I would use Angie in this weekend, and whatever ideas Amadeus had didn't figure into them. I wasn't opposed to sleeping with women I'd just met, but the idea of sleeping with someone who might not be 100% on board with it was a non-starter for me. I told him I needed to set up my tent, but it was quickly whisked away by a pair of women in homespun dresses, who started setting it up near Amadeus's large, ornate tent. So instead, Angie and I set about setting up the protective circle. I won't bore you with the details. My process probably wouldn't work for you anyway. We set about digging a small trench around the campsite and filled it with items I would use to seal the circle. If this sounds dumb to you, it sounds pretty dumb to me too. When I look back on it through the lens of time, I realize I was no less deluded than the rest of them. But that kind of code of silence with these communities is pretty common. Even if you think someone is full of shit, you keep your mouth shut, because you don't want them to call you on your bullshit. If you're lucky, you grow out of it. If you're not, you become like Amadeus and his little harem. Hopefully not literally, though. By the time we finished, I was sweaty and ready to settle down for the night. Angie had been a pretty big help, and as we talked, I learned that she'd been with the community for about 7 years. One of the women, whose hair was very similar to Angie's, kept bringing us water, and I started to suspect that she might be Angie's mom. We set up the ingredients, and as we finished, I instructed her to start lighting the sage bundles. I had placed them every few feet. Once they were smoking, I lit the sticks and leaves that I had put in there too, and hoped they would create a smoldering circle that would last until morning. When we stepped back inside, I spoke some pseudo-Latin, made some more vaguely mystic hand gestures, and declared the circle closed. That seemed to be enough for the coven, and they began to set up around the fire pit. The coolers, as it turned out, were full of beer. The women brought out a large pot full of soup makings and set it on a hanger over the fire. Amadeus brought out a trunk from his tent, and I saw him pass out baggies of what I assumed were drugs. Mushrooms seemed to be the drug of choice, but there were a lot of people lighting pipes, and more than one person I saw snorting something off the back of their hand. A group of young men were listening to Amadeus wax philosophical, and he leaned over to let me know that my secondary duties for the evening were about to begin. I sighed. I guess I was on guide duty then. I'd played the guide before at gatherings like this, and it was rarely fun once people started using drugs and getting drunk. I guess designated adult sounds less fun than guide, but that was essentially what I was there to do. My job was to make sure that no one wandered off into the woods, no one slept on their back and drowned in their own vomit, and no one tried to jump into the fire. Amadeus and his flock drank heavily and used heartily, but I was surprised at how tame the gathering was. Amadeus and about 5 or 6 young men were pretty much waited on hand and foot by the 24 women, and Angie seemed to think it was her job to do the same for me. I had soup when I wanted it, despite me telling her I could get it myself. She also intercepted anyone who tried to offer me a beer or a drug and kept a bottle of water close at my hand. She helped me with the 2 or 3 times I needed to help someone from tripping over the circle, and she was a delight to talk with. She was knowledgeable about a lot of the things that I was interested in, and I found myself having a good time, despite being an outsider in what was likely a cult gathering. I was just about to make a Kool-Aid joke when the soup pot was taken away, and 3 women carried out a heavy iron vessel that they hung in its place. It was ugly and ill-made, not the beautiful thing you usually think of for these sorts of things. It looked like a big teapot, so much as anything, and the women started shoving bundles of herbs into the top of it. I had no idea what kind of herbs they were, and when I asked, Amadeus, he just winked and tittered. I told him if they were planning to flood the campsite with smoke, I wouldn't be able to guide them if I was under the influence of whatever he was putting in that pot. He snorted. These herbs are not for us. This is smoke to entice the spirits." He called everyone close and set them around the fire as the kettle began to heat up and the smoke started creeping out. "Good evening, my children. The meal has been eaten and the circle has been set by our most generous guide." What followed was a scattering of applause, and I nodded half-heartedly. "Now, for the reason we are all here. The smoke will attract the spirits that dwell in this forest, and we will be free to view them from a safe distance as they are unable to cross our barrier." The smoke had begun to increase a bit, and I could see it making its way up the spout and across the campsite. It smelled terrible, like burning syrup, but it didn't seem to be having much of an effect on anyone. Most of them were already tripping on mushrooms or any number of other things, and the smoke did little more than make them wrinkle their noses. As it began to bellow out, the herbs catching fire, Amadeus continued to talk about philosophy and magic and a good number of other things. His followers sat dutifully, hanging on his every word, and I tried to be polite as I checked my phone to see if I had any service. To no one's surprise, I had no bars, so I put it away and tried to act interested in Amadeus's impromptu TED Talk. As I listened, though, I started hearing noises in the woods. The smoke was pretty thick by then, Amadeus giving his dissertation in a fog bank, and I started hearing noises. I mentioned this to Amadeus, and he got pretty excited. He instructed his followers to start chanting. He took it up first, and they started copying him in a shaky, undulating tone. I got up and went to the edge of the circle, kind of figuring the smoke had upset some of the natural wildlife, and I wanted to see what we had attracted the attention of. It was midsummer, and the idea that we had pissed off a bear or a small group of coyotes or feral dogs was not outside the realm of possibility. I stood at the edge of the circle, not wanting to break it and mess up whatever protective magic I had going on, and I squinted out into the dark woods. Now, if you've never been camping out in the real woods, the first thing you come to realize is that it's really dark out there. I know that sounds obvious, but it's a different kind of dark than the normal city dark. The woods really only have to deal with the intrusion of the moon at night, and with the campfire starting to come down off its normal roar, it was pretty dark outside the circle I had made. I squinted and looked, but honestly a bear could have swiped my face off before I saw him. I could hear something crunching around out there, something that sounded big. I returned to the fire, the flock still chanting and undulating, and I could hear the crunching noises coming from several points at once. "He has heard our call!" Amadeus rejoiced. That was when the trees started shaking. Out in the woods, I could see the shadows of trees being shaken and pushed violently. Limbs were snapped all over the place, and as they shook, there was an underlying sound accompanying it. Something was scraping the tree bark, peeling it away angrily as whatever it was, whatever they were, kept battering the trees around the campsite. I say they because it wasn't just one tree that was shaking. It was 2, then 3, then 7, and before long, it seemed like the whole forest was trying to get up and leave. Above the sound of shaking trees and snapping limbs, I could hear animal sounds too. I could hear dogs and cats and birds, the grunt of deer, the growl of a bear, the snort of horses, and all of it around the campsite. I've been present for some weird stuff that makes me feel pretty secure in the belief that something was out there. But this was different. This was downright terrifying. The flock, however, was in ecstasy. This is apparently what they had wanted, what they had been waiting for, and they quickly moved to the edge of the circle so they could see what was out there. I, however, went back to my tent to get something out of my duffel bag. I was kind of done with this. The magic had gotten pretty real pretty quick, and I wanted to see what exactly was out there. I still figured our smoke had pissed off a herd of deer or maybe a wild dog pack, maybe even a bear, and I didn't want to suddenly become dinner for something big and angry. I had packed a deer spotting light that my dad had given me for Christmas, and I wanted to know right now what was out there making all that racket. When I came out with it, I lit up a big section of woods and started hunting. One of the boys that had been sitting with Amadeus slapped it out of my hand after about 20 seconds. But honestly, that was about 15 seconds longer than I needed. When the light fell on a deer, I almost breathed a sigh of relief. Well, not a deer. Not really. It had antlers, so I guessed it was actually a buck. The antlers, however, were long. The tines sort of wound together like vines. It was up on its hind legs, scraping its hooves against the tree in a way that I thought was kind of strange for a deer. I had heard of young bucks rubbing their antlers against the trees, mostly to get the velvet off or to scratch an itch, but I had never heard of them rubbing their hooves against the tree. When it turned its head to look at me, its eyes glowed like a dog's in a camera flash. When it turned its head, I could see that half of the velvety skin was torn, showing the muscles of its face and the bone beneath. I took all this in before the light was slapped out of my hand, and I backed away from the circle, suddenly wanting none of this. People were standing around the edges of the circle, and as I backed away, I saw someone step over the trench and walk into the woods. Others followed suit, stepping into the ditch and snuffing out the sage. This would create a hole in the circle. This would allow whatever that was to come into our campsite. In my mind, we were breached already, and this job had just become pretty dangerous. I am completely unashamed to say that I went to my tent, dug the padlock out, padlocked my tent from the inside, and stayed there until morning. As I pulled the sleeping bag up around me, I could hear people outside the tent. From the dancing fire pit, I could see the shadows of things in the campsite as well. Some of them were on 2 feet, but some of them were walking on 4 feet. Some of the people out there were laughing, others were crying, some were definitely screaming as they plunged into the dark woods. I shivered with fear till morning, and when the sun came up, I collected my things and got out. The campsite wasn't some sacrificial pit, though. I could see people lying around the campsite in various states of undress, and the area around the bonfire was trashed. Coolers were smashed, beer cans were stomped and torn, and vegetables and food packages were strewn everywhere. Of Amadeus, there was no sign. I never saw him again, and Patrick said no one had heard from him after that night. His coven dissipated after that, and I never heard from any of them ever again. I was never paid the other half of my fee, but I suppose that was fitting. I had failed to guide them, and the ritual had gone astray. All I know is I ran the mile back to my car and never looked back. I did a little research on my own when I got home. Turns out there have been a lot of weird happenings in those woods. People have reported seeing lights in the sky, hearing strange noises, hearing animals that aren't native to the region, and a feeling of overall dread felt by those who stay there overnight. People have gone missing in those woods too, and authorities have never found a trace of them. I'm not going to sit here and claim that I had some kind of paranormal experience out there. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a skinwalker or a wendigo or an alien or anything like that. I'm not going to tell you that I saw a ghost or a cryptid or any of that either. What likely happened was that Amadeus was burning some kind of psychotropic drugs in a kettle, and we all experienced some kind of group hallucination out there. These are the things that I saw, and these are the things that I told my friends as we sat drinking around our yearly bonfire that night. After I told them my story, more than a few of them moved inside. So I got a weird message about 2 weeks ago. A message from Andromeda, aka Angie. Some of you may have read the story I posted not long ago about the time I went camping with a coven out in the woods. Some weird stuff happened, I got some pretty culty vibes, and they may have pissed off some spirits out in the woods. After locking myself in my tent for the night, I left the next day and never heard from them again. Until I got that message from Andromeda. I woke up from 6 hours of fitful sleep, so regular sleep cycle for me, to find a message in my Reddit inbox. It was as follows. Hey asshole, I read your little story. That's a real dick move trying to cash in on the suffering of my family. But hey, I'm glad you got some internet points from what was one of the worst days of my life. I can't believe I told you how I got my name. That was a story of significance, which I see wasn't important enough to add. I've never even told my husband that story, and you repaid me by abandoning my family to the spirits. I hope you're proud of yourself. I won't link the screen name because I don't want to dox the user, but I was ready to ignore it and move on at first glance. They read like a troll post, someone just trying to get a rise out of me. I tried to move on and get started with my day, but my mind seemed to want to return to the message again and again. The more I read over it, the more one thing jumped out at me. The part about her telling me her name was unique, because she was right. I hadn't mentioned it in my story. She had told me how she came to be named Andromeda on that long ago night, and I thought it was interesting at the time. interesting enough to remember, but apparently not interesting enough to put in the story. I suppose, in a way, I had left it out because it was pretty personal. When she told me her name, when we first met, I had assumed it was a vaguely mystic-sounding name. After all, her mother had been named Cassio, and many of the other members had sported names like Betelgeuse or Orion or Ambrosia. I assumed that mystic names or spacey-sounding names had been selected to make them sound mysterious or wise. Andromeda, however, was different. Andromeda had had her name since birth. Mom named me after a princess in Greek mythology. She had hoped I would grow to be a strong leader with a name like that. I think my father approved as well. I haven't seen him since Mom left to be Amadeus' handmaiden. She and Dad's relationship had gotten rocky, and they split when I was 12. That was when we joined the coven. My dad died about a year ago. Cancer, they told me. I'd love to go visit his grave, though, make sure it's well maintained. I could hear her words echoing in my head, and it caused me to be transported through time for a moment. For a few seconds, I was sitting by the fire and listening to Angie talk about her family and the coven that she loved so much. After a few minutes of conversation, it became apparent that she really loved her newfound family. She had come to think of Amadeus as a second father, and remembering how he had insinuated that I might use Andromeda made me feel squirmy again, though she must not have noticed. We had spent a lot of time talking that night. I decided to press my luck and send her a message back. So if this is really Andromeda, you should know what constellation you were named after. It took a few hours, but she finally got back to me. Wow, did you really forget? I wasn't named after a constellation. I told you that. I was named after a Greek princess. After reading that, I was pretty sure we were on the same page. But I wanted to make sure. Have you visited your dad since we last spoke? You said you wanted to help him with some gardening. This one didn't take nearly as long, and 5 minutes later, she sent me another curt reply. My dad is dead, which I also told you. As for gardening, I don't know what you're talking about. I have been to his gravesite, and I help maintain it since I live so close now. That convinced me of who I was talking to. I apologized for the weird messages. I told her that sometimes people like to play games on the internet. I don't want to waste my time with someone only interested in LARPing through someone else's memories. I also told her that I was sorry about what had happened that night. I was young and dumb, and the situation had gotten out of hand pretty quickly. I regretted what must have happened to her in the chaos, and told her I was glad she had survived. That's how we began our correspondence. She was cold for the first few messages, answering in clipped little responses, but she began to warm up as we talked. She asked me about that night, asking why I had left and why I had abandoned my post. Again, I told her my only real defense was that I was a young, dumb kid who'd gotten in over his head. She wanted to argue this point with me, but ultimately she was forced to agree that the situation had gotten out of hand pretty quickly. I apologized again, telling her I had since gotten out of the guide game, and she seemed to soften a little. She still refused to talk about what had happened that night, at least at first. So we spent the next few weeks catching up on neutral topics. She was living in Arizona in her dad's old house. She was raising her son and had needed a change from the Georgia area. She had met her husband at a bookstore she worked at. They'd been married for about 5 years. She was mostly mad at me because the story had made her think about that night for the first time in 8 years. We talked a lot that week, skipping over problematic issues in favor of some neutral subjects. I was delighted she had reached out again. It answered a lot of questions I'd been thinking about since telling my story. Then, one afternoon, about a week ago, she sent me a new message. I think I'm ready to tell you the rest of the story. I'm sorry I was rude to you, though I still feel like I was justified to be. If you'd like to post it on Reddit, go ahead. Maybe people would like to hear the rest of the story. Do you want to hear it? I told her I would, and she told me what had happened the night I fled into my tent. On the night you ran, I was trying to quell the people who were heading for the woods. The noises were getting louder and closer, and I really wanted our circle to be maintained. I stopped a few of them at the circle's edge, turning them around, and then looked and saw you staring out into the woods. It was only for a second, but you had the weirdest look on your face. It was like you saw something that made your brain hurt, something you were incapable of understanding. I watched you, watching it, and I felt afraid of what exactly you could be seeing. What was it that Amadeus had actually summoned here? And could our circle really hold it back? Then someone slapped your light out of your hand and you just walked away. I watched you go, completely shocked. You ran to your tent and just locked yourself in. What had you seen? What was it out in those woods that scared you so much? I didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I started to go after you to try to get you to come back, but that was when I saw my mom heading for the circle. I turned all my attention to her, trying vainly to make her go sit down. She was staring at something blankly as if something was calling to her. A lot of them had that look about them, but they must have been intoxicated, because they stayed down when I pushed them. Mom was different. She fought me, struggled against me, and when I tried to stop her. She finally had enough and shoved me aside. Then she stepped over the circle and headed out into the woods like a sleepwalker. I headed in after her, not thinking of anything but stopping her, but quickly regretted it as the darkness enveloped me. The woods were dark, the blackness hanging around me like a thick veil. It's just so dark out in those woods, though I guess I don't need to tell you that. It's a different kind of dark, though. A real dark. It's a sentient kind of dark, and the things that live out there know better than we do. One of those things found me while I was wandering around out there. Thankfully, I don't remember much about what happened that night. I only remember something found me in the woods, and it was so terrible that my mind blocked it out so thoroughly I can't even remember more than pieces of it now. All I know was when I woke up the following day, I was already sure I was pregnant. She stopped there for a time, clearly needing to collect her thoughts. I gave her time, not wanting to push too hard. She was telling me about what was likely the worst experience of her life, and I didn't want to be too insensitive. I did, however, ask a single impertinent question. A question I never got an answer to. The thing in the woods, was it a deer that stood on two legs? She said nothing for nearly 2 days. Then one morning, I woke up to a long message she had sent around 12 midnight the night before. So after I came out of the woods, I found the campsite in complete disarray. I had apparently been missing for a whole day, which explained why I was so hungry. Of the original 30 people, there were about 20 now. My mother was among the missing, as was Amadeus. A few more wandered back before Sunday, 2 of the women having that faraway look that I came out with. By the end of the weekend, we had 24 members of our 30-person coven. Our leader was gone, however, and that left us with a problem. Who would lead our group now? We piled into our vehicles and went back to the house, figuring we would decide on a new leader once we arrived. For a month, we just sort of rebuilt our coven. Amadeus had controlled all the bank accounts, all the financial records. We had to find some way to support ourselves. We had to figure out how we would pay our bills, how we would feed our members, how we would keep the large house and the land that he had rented for us. Since it was in his name, the landlord was under no obligation to renew our lease when it expired. These were things we contemplated, but others believed they had found the answer. Their answers doomed us in the end. She was silent again for a few days, apparently assembling her information. It took 2 more days for her to get everything together, and that gave me some time to think about what I had gotten myself mixed up in. I had stumbled into something, coven or cult, much bigger than even I had suspected. I felt even worse about abandoning them in the woods now, and I suspected that her story was only going to get worse as it stretched on. Then one morning, I found her next message. I don't know if you're aware, but Amadeus has 3 children. Capua is his oldest, and he holds a master's in religious study from Georgia Tech. Legua is his middle child, and she owns several businesses in the area worth quite a bit of money. I didn't know the older 2 very well, but I knew the youngest, Aberdeen. We had been friends when I first arrived, and he was only a few years older than me. Aberdeen was still with our coven. You met him, though you may not remember him. He was sitting around the fire with Amadeus and the other scholars the day you first arrived. Well, in the absence of the father, we had hoped that the son might serve. Aberdeen, or Abner as I always called him, was trying his best, but he was not his father. For one, Amadeus had trusted him with none of the accounts for the coven. For another, Abner was not well respected. He was not as ambitious as his siblings, and was not what you would call a strong leader. His father had often belittled him in front of the others, yelling at him for not being as successful as his siblings, and it had given him a complex that made him a bit of a people pleaser. He was the acting figurehead, but mostly it was the elders that ran the coven. at least until Abner's siblings showed up one day. We had been on our own for about 6 months, and my pregnancy had become more than just an idea. I wasn't alone either. 2 of the other girls had come out of the woods pregnant, and one of them, Ambrosia, was having a hard time. Dr. Fussell had said all our babies were healthy, as far as he could tell, but that Ambrosia's baby was different. She seemed to be carrying it lower than expected, but he couldn't be sure without an ultrasound. It also seemed to be larger than either of the other babies, and she was having some mysterious bouts of pain and bleeding. Forstasia, the third girl, was reporting some odd cramps, but was otherwise healthy. As for me, my pregnancy seemed to be proceeding normally, but since it was my first, I really had nothing to compare it with. I wasn't bleeding or having weird pains, and my baby was simply growing and moving as it seemed like it should. Abner had actually offered me a marriage proposal since we'd come back from the woods, and I was considering taking him up on it. He had no qualms about raising another man's child, and he admitted that he'd always been sweet on me. I had known that, of course, but I had never thought his father would approve of me. Amadeus liked me and all, but I had never considered I would be good enough for one of his sons. I agreed to Abner's proposal, and we were engaged. I was so happy. I would have a husband and a baby, and we could build a life together here. Then, one day, Capua pulled up in his big fancy Cadillac car. He came into the house, asking where his father was and why he hadn't heard from him in so long. Capua was often around, talking to his father and asking his advice on things. Capua was a minister, but it often felt like his plans were skirting cult territory. Truth be told, Amadeus had skirted into cult territory a time or two, but he always maintained our strict coven status. Abner greeted his brother warmly, but Capua wasn't having any pleasantries. When he learned that his father was missing, you could see the gleam in his eye. He asked Abner if we needed money and asked how we were faring. Abner answered him honestly. Abner was leading us well, and we were making it. We weren't as comfortable as we had been, but we were making our own way. Abner told him about our engagement, and he congratulated us, though half-heartedly. He left, but he wasn't the last visitor we'd see that day. Legua came that afternoon in her Jeep. She had clearly spoken with her brother, because she asked right away about Amadeus. Unlike Capua, Legua did not often come to visit her father. She sometimes came to ask for money, and Amadeus often told her that he didn't have anything for her. For someone who had several successful businesses, she certainly had a problem hanging on to money. However, she acted as Amadeus's accountant and knew the kind of money we usually brought into her father's accounts. I talk about money, and that may seem strange. Our coven was self-sustaining. We grew crops on the land out behind our house. Amadeus had secured us nearly 5 acres, and we sold the extra produce at farmers markets and to local businesses looking for organically grown produce. 30 people don't eat as much as you might think, and there was always extra to sell. We also produced things like olive oil, cooked a certain amount of moonshine, and grew a little marijuana to help supplement our income. Legua always made sure our books were in apple pie order during tax season. We never quite achieved tax-exempt status like some covens, and this allowed her to know exactly how lucrative our coven was. When we told her that we didn't even have access to the accounts, she left in a hurry, clearly wanting to get a hold of them before her brother did. That was how the two of them came to be at odds over our small group. She took a break again, and I didn't hear from her for almost another 2 days. I took the opportunity to do a little research of my own, Googling the names she'd given me. Names like Capua and Legua, even Aberdeen, would stand out in a small town like Dahlonega. Without a last name, however, Aberdeen didn't bring up much. An advertisement for an Aberdeen Tools in Garland, an obituary for an Aberdeen Freeman, and a missing person case on an Aberdeen Forklay. Nothing too promising, but the last one made me curious. How many Aberdeens could there really be? The names Capua and Legua, however, brought more promising results. Capua brought only one person, Capua Forklay. His Facebook was inactive, but spoke about how he was the pastor of Fairweather Flock, and had several pictures of him giving sermons and holding services at his church. There was also a local piece about how he had been the head of a rising flock before he and his followers had disappeared suddenly and unexpectedly about 6 years ago. A different online piece was calling them some kind of religious cult that had suddenly and mysteriously disappeared, leaving some 70 people unaccounted for and his compound outside of Dahlonega empty. It seemed to be widely believed that Father Forclay had taken his flock to Mexico, where he had another compound from which he did missionary work. This had never been confirmed, however, and remained a piece of local gossip to this day. As for Lagua, her name returned a LinkedIn page for a Lagua Forclay, a Facebook profile that was also inactive, and several reviews for her business that pinned her in an unflattering light. From what I could gather, Lagua Forclay had owned 2 restaurants, a trendy boutique, and a bar in Gainesville. I found an article linked to her name with a lot of speculation about shady business practices, and a comment left on her Facebook insinuating that she might have had a gambling problem. Another local piece questioned her involvement with organized crime, but that seemed a bit of a stretch in a place like Gainesville. As to what had happened to her, however, I could find nothing. A similar last name to the missing person case for Aberdeen led me to believe that this may have been the brood that Angie was talking about. When she came back, she apologized for the radio silence. I'll have to give you the abridged version of the rest of this. I'm on the move and my signal comes and goes. When I asked if she was heading back in this direction, she ignored the question and continued her story. For the next few weeks, things went along pretty smoothly. Abner proved to be a fairly capable leader, so long as the council was leading him. I was planning my wedding, honestly glad that Abner had suggested marriage the more I thought about it. My prospects were limited as a single mother with a baby on the way, and Abner's prospects were not so great either, since he was kind of inept with women. We never got very far in our plans, though. Abner came to me one morning and told me that his siblings wanted to meet. They knew he didn't have access to the accounts, and they wanted to help him. Lagua knew that our finances were stable but not strong, and Capua knew that he could help us into a more stable position. Abner was honestly just happy to meet with them. He had never been well liked by his siblings, and he said it finally felt like they were treating him like an equal. I warned him against the meeting, fearing that something was up, but he insisted that his siblings wouldn't hurt him. They just want to talk about the direction of the coven, that's all. They're not going to hurt me. We're family. I kissed his cheek and told him to be careful, watching him climb into his old Ford and drive down the dirt road towards town. That was the last time anyone ever saw him. I was worried about him, but I didn't have long to focus on his plight. That same day Abner left, they found Forsacia dead in her bed. One of her friends had gone to check on her and discovered her lying dead amidst a wash of blood. Dr. Fussell inspected the body and said that something had ruptured her insides, causing her to bleed out. Her baby was also dead, though it no longer seemed she'd been carrying a baby. Dr. Fussell wouldn't let anyone see it, but some had claimed that it had horns as well as hooves. That had made me grip my own stomach, worrying about my child. Dr. Fussell made house calls, but he was little more than a backcountry doctor. He didn't even have an ultrasound machine, nothing modern to tell us how our babies were doing or forming. I had felt mine kick a bit, but it felt normal as it could feel, I guess. I started making funerary plans for Forstacia, and before I knew it, it was 2 days later and Abner still wasn't back. I woke up one morning to find his siblings arguing in the entryway of our home. They had drawn quite a crowd, and I waddled down the stairs to join them, hoping for any information on Abner. He had been gone for days, as I said, but I had been in no position to make any inquiries about him. I came downstairs hoping for answers, only to find a divided room. Capua saw me and immediately called me over to stand with Ambrosia. He wanted to bring the coven into his flock, and after hearing about the events in the woods, he told them that we two were carrying miracle children. Gifts from God, he kept saying, and his direction for our coven was starting to sound very culty. He wanted to move us to his compound so we could be taken care of and the flock could grow. Lagua, however, was hearing none of it. She called him a shyster and talked about how he wanted to ruin her father's legacy and use us as tools. She wanted to keep us here and working, and I came to understand that her desires were more of a financial means. She wanted to make money. She wanted the money we brought in, especially since her brother now had access to Amadeus's funds. Money he has stolen from this coven, she claimed, and she was hoping to use our efforts in the local market to help offset her own debt. Standing there, even as young as I was, I came to see that neither of them had our best interests in heart. In the end, Ambrosia and I went with Capua, as did most of the coven. Abner was gone, and I was in no condition to leave in my state of pregnancy. Capua wanted to make the two of us into some kind of figurehead for this new flock, and I figured it would be easier to leave after the baby was born than it would be to leave now and risk his life. Lagua had some 8 of us that stayed. The rest of us left. The next 3 months went by in a blur. We all moved to the large private compound that Capua owned, and he set us up with quarters, fresh clothes, and 3 meals a day. Ambrosia and I were put in private rooms. We were treated like royalty. We ate what we wanted, did what we wanted, and we were well taken care of. Capua got us a real doctor, and he had concerns about Ambrosia's baby. He was too big to deliver naturally, and he had deformities, he said. The doctor was unsure. Ultrasounds have come a long way since then, but he said the head and body were oddly shaped. He told me that my baby was healthy looking and was a boy. I decided to name him Michael, and we went along for the next few months. It all went pretty well till the night of the birth. That was when all hell broke loose. Michael came at 10:22 p.m., and he was as easy a birth as I could have asked for. He never cried, which worried the doctor, but he started eating right away when he put him in my arms. He looked up at me the whole time, and when he smiled around my nipple, I fell in love with him. He was a handsome little boy, handsome as anyone could have asked for, and he had crystal blue eyes and a head full of duck fuzz. From the next bed over, however, it appeared that Ambrosia was having a hard time. They had been forced to strap her to the bed. She kept saying that something sharp was poking her insides. She kept trying to hit herself. The OB wanted to take her to the hospital, but Capua said she would deliver at his compound. They tried to sedate her so they could begin the C-section, but the drugs never seemed to take. I tried not to watch, but when she screamed out suddenly and pitifully, I looked over to see something brown and glistening protruding from her abdomen. The doctors had taken a step back, not sure what to do, and Ambrosia just went right on screaming. She writhed as the antler tore through her flesh, and her screams became less and less shrill as the blood began to flow. It shook its head, worrying at her, and I saw something smooth and brown push its way out. It looked at me, and I thought I knew what you had seen in the woods that night. It ripped itself from its mother like a butterfly from a cocoon, and I heard them scream as it tore out of the room, hooves clattering on the floor. Capua arrived not long after, wanting a report and clearly not liking what he heard. He took people with him to hunt the creature, and before he left, he looked at Michael and smiled. "Thankfully, your baby is normal. We'll need to run some tests once things have calmed down a little. Can't have 2 of these monsters running about." Thankfully, even after the day I had had, I still managed some clarity. I grabbed what essentials I could lay hands on. Some clothes for me, some clothes for Michael, some medicine, some food, and we stole a car from the motor pool downstairs. Capua had maintained a motor pool on his compound, and with all the men out hunting for this thing, it was easy to just leave. We sold the car the next day and hopped a bus to my daddy's old house in Arizona. It had been left to me in his will, and after a quick stop by the lawyer's office and some paperwork being signed, Michael and I had a home. We lived there until we met Jonathan, and now we live there as a family. Well, we did at least. That was the last message I had from her for nearly a week. I kept trying to contact Angie. That last message had been very cryptic, but she wouldn't send me anything. I was afraid that maybe she had gone back to her old home, back to Capua's compound even, and I spent the next 6 days in a state of anxiety. Then, on the 7th day, she sent me her last message. "I gotta make this quick. It'll be dark soon. About a month ago, Michael started having nightmares. He dreamed about the forest, about a dark forest, in which a voice called to him. The voice told him things, secret things that he couldn't tell me, and it also told him to come home. 2 weeks ago, Jonathan caught him trying to sneak out. What a boy of 8 thought he was going to do on the road alone, I don't know, but when Jonathan tried to stop him, he killed him. I heard the ruckus coming from downstairs and went down to find my husband dead and my son pointing a knife at me. He said he was going, that he couldn't make the voices stop anymore, and he was going to the woods. He was going to see his father. After seeing what he'd done here, I knew he didn't have much of a choice. So, here we are. I lit my fire in the same fire pit we used the other times we came here. The two of us are just sitting here, watching the sunset, waiting for whatever intends to show up. At first, I blamed you for all this. I thought you might have forced this into reality, but now I see that it's just my past catching up with me. I've run for too long. It's time to face the music. I can hear something out there. It speaks in the voices of every animal. It moves the trees as it watches us. Michael says it's his father, and I'm afraid it is. Goodbye. I hope the story was worth it. That was the last I ever heard from her. I looked into it, and the police did find a car on that old access road I'd parked on so many years ago. I told my friend, a cop in the Gainesville area, about the messages, but he only shrugged. They didn't find anyone out there, and he says it's honestly not the first abandoned vehicle they've found on that old access road. These are old woods, you know. Sometimes people just disappear into them. Whatever Andromeda was looking for out there, I hope she found it. I hope whatever Michael's father is, he treats them well. That's why I'm posting this. I feel like she'd want her story told. Andromeda would want people to know about the strange, bizarre, wonderful life she lived. I was talking with a ranger on shift the other day, and he had a strange story from a couple of years ago. The ranger, we'll call him Jacob, had been doing this for about 15 years, and he's seen more in that time here than I could ever hope to. Missing kids, murdered campers, lost people who just wander up out of the depths after being gone for decades, lost hikers who aren't as lost as we might think. We were talking about weird stuff in the park. I had told him about the train that I had encountered while looking for the kid, and he asked me if I'd seen any weird critters in the woods. I told him I had, filling him in on the thing about the butterflies and the other thing, before asking what sort of things he had seen. He got quiet for a minute as he thought about the best way to tell it. I almost thought he wasn't going to, but he seemed to decide on it after some quiet and leaned in close like he was afraid that someone would hear him. You know how far our property goes, right? Like damn near to the outskirts of Atlanta, and then up to North Carolina. The park looks like a long, jagged scar on the map, and the park's size is really kind of daunting. There are some 30 rangers to cover the whole park, which is why we end up calling in volunteers for large-scale searches. The saving grace is that a lot of it is dense woodland tracks, animal sanctuaries, spots too difficult to get to for your average hiker. The park that the guests see is a squirt in the bucket, and we have a hard time maintaining that. I nodded, not sure where he was going with this, but curious nonetheless. So one afternoon, as I was manning the phones at the station, I get a call about a vehicle that's parked along an access road near the northern edge. The second they told me the location, I knew this was going to be some weirdness. I tried to call a couple of rangers that were also on duty in the park, but none of them had their ears on, it seemed. In the end, I decided to go myself, and I found myself dreading the trip. I asked him why, and he looked at me like I was slow. It was the LK-76 access road. When I didn't immediately look startled, he rolled his eyes at me. God, you must be new. The LK-76 road is that road they had all the missing hikers on about 10 years ago. There was a gathering in the woods near the access road. A bunch of hippie types with tents and stuff. And the Forestry Service was out there for days trying to track them all down. It was one of the biggest incidents I was ever a part of, and some of those people are still missing to this day. There's about 10 names still on that list as unfound, and I doubt we'll ever locate them. You know as well as I do that sometimes people go into those woods and just don't come back out. And this was a larger event than most in that respect. I tried to remember if I'd heard anything about that, and I decided it probably wasn't the kind of thing they put in the orientation packet. So there I am, driving an hour out to the spot in question, and I get there just as dusk is setting in. There's a minivan parked by the side of the dirt road, just like the report had said, and as I'm looking at the tag and calling it in, I see something glint off the metal and turn to see a fire in the woods. Not like a forest fire, but like a campfire off the road a ways. Looks to be less than a mile in, and if night hadn't been falling pretty damn quick, I would have probably never seen it. I decided to go check it out, thinking it was probably just the owner of the van, and come up on a familiar clearing that I haven't thought about in years. The last time I'd seen it, the place was full of tents and trash, people sitting around asking questions from park staff. Tonight, though, there was only a single fire burning in the pit. A young woman was sitting beside it, maybe 30 at the most, with a sleeping kid in her lap. The kid was school-aged, probably about 9, and she looked at me expectantly as I stepped close to her fire. Her expectation turned to surprise, however, and it appeared I wasn't who she was looking for. "Oh, sorry, I was expecting someone else," she said. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," I said, taking a seat by the fire. "We had reports of a vehicle on the access road, and when I saw your fire, I thought it might belong to you." She nodded at me. "It is. My son and I are just waiting for his father to join us. No need to worry about us." Looking around, I decided there might be several reasons to worry about them. It was August at the time, and she was in a simple dress and no shoes. The kid was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, though at least he had shoes on. There wasn't a sleeping bag or a tent in sight, and though the season was mild, it could still get down in the low 40s at night. I didn't see any coolers for food or water either, and unless the fella she was waiting on was bringing a whole bunch of supplies, they were likely in for a bad time. She smiled when I told her that, stroking the kid's hair as he slept soundly against her. "Not quite as prepared as I was the first time I camped here, but once his father arrives, I doubt we'll need much of anything." "Have you camped out here before?" I asked, the campfire casting her face in a ghostly refrain. "Once, when I was very young. My family came out here to commune with nature and got a little more than they bargained for." I sat for a moment, listening to the fire crackle, mulling over what she had said and guessing at the meaning. "You don't mean you were here with those people?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes turning a little hot. "Those people were my family. At least they were back then," she added, the last like an afterthought, and it cooled some of the heat in those eyes. As I listened, I realized I had heard what he was talking about before. How could I have forgotten? It had been all over the news when I was in middle school, and it had been all anyone could talk about for weeks. It had excited a lot of people in the worst way possible in my semi-religious community. The news reports had called the group Satanists, but Mom and Dad had told us they were probably just people out doing crazy things in the woods. Ties to Satan or not, a bunch of them had gone missing, and the ones that had come out of the woods hadn't been right. They claimed they had seen things they couldn't quite explain, and for 2 weeks there had been general panic around whatever they had seen and whatever they had been doing out in the woods. I wanted to ask her to tell me what had happened, but it seemed rude at the time. How do you just ask someone to explain to you about what was probably one of the worst days of their life? Turned out I didn't have to ask. As we sat there listening to the fire, she just began talking, uninvited. He had taken me out of my thoughts when he started talking, and I focused my attention back on him. Our leader had brought us out to the woods to be with nature, but he actually meant to commune with something else. We didn't know that he had been researching local legends and had decided that whatever was in the woods was worth seeking. He wanted us to be safe, though. He wasn't a complete fool, so he enlisted the help of a local guide. The kid, at the time he was only a little older than I was, came well vetted, but turned out to be a little green. He set up what he believed was a proper protective circle, burnt the right things to keep whatever might come at bay, but it was all for nothing. She then looked down at the kid sleeping on her lap as she stroked his hair. I can't lay it all at his feet, I suppose. We did our part as well. Amadeus had whipped them into a frenzy with a mixture of drugs and alcohol, and when we got what we wanted, we decided to get nosy. We went to investigate, despite the advice of the guide, and ended up unmaking all of his preparations. With the protection unmade, he decided to wash his hands of us, and went to go protect himself instead. I went to try and help my friends and family, but that's when I met this one's father. She stopped long enough for me to think she wouldn't go on, and when she started again, it was a little surprising. I remember jumping as if struck, her voice older than her 30 years, and wondered if I wanted to know the end. He met several members of my family that night, but to 3 of us, he left little gifts. Gifts like this one, she said, as she looked down at the sleeping boy. Gifts that killed the other 2, but not me for some reason. Is that why you're out here? I asked. She nodded. He's been calling to the boy, telling him things that he can't understand, telling him things that he doesn't want to understand. It was inevitable that he would call him back, so now we've come to see it through. We were quiet for a little while, but all at once it began to sound like something was moving in the woods. It was big, whatever it was, and I began to hear noises that didn't make a lot of sense. The grunts of deer, the soft chuffing of bears, the clittering sound of raccoons, the chirping of squirrels, and all of it seemed to swirl around us like an angry wind. I whipped my head about as if I might keep it at bay with the knowledge that I could see it, but the woman had no such idea. She just sat and stroked her child, looking as if this was what she had expected to find. It appears that he has found us. I would suggest you leave, if you ever intend to leave again. If my van is still there tomorrow, go ahead and have it towed. I don't think I'll be needing it. Not where I'm going. I didn't need any more prompting than that. I ran out of that clearing, heading in the direction I believed the road to be. Behind me, the fire went out, and I heard those noises converge on that clearing, like waves rolling up to the shore. Fortunately for me, I had been correct. I came out on the road about 30 minutes later, and after getting in my truck, I drove like the devil himself was behind me. I got a call 3 days later to let me know the van was still out there, and I told them to call the wrecker and have it towed back to the city. Whoever she wasn't going to need it anymore. The 2 of us sat there as his story came to a close, and I suddenly felt as if my forest train was nothing more special than a tree full of newborn squirrels. It's best to remember, strange things happen in these woods. You could try to rack your brain over it, like I did with the woman and her campfire, but it'll never lead you to anything. It's best to just put it out of your mind and go about your business. Otherwise, you might become whatever it is business in the end. He left then, getting in his car and driving home, and after locking up the ranger station for the night, I did the same. I've got more stories from my first year as a park ranger, and maybe I'll tell you if the Park Service doesn't shut me down. Till then, take care of yourselves while you're out in the woods. Treat them with respect, because they will not hold the same respect for you. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstead, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.